Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first Alta Pro Risk Purchasing Group free CLE webinar of 2021. Thanks for joining. Today's webinar is entitled Cyber Best Practices for 2021 and is the fourth and what's become actually a very popular topic according to your feedback from previous webinars, and that's the whole aspect of cybersecurity. Look, we all know and read every day about the increasing and real threat of cybercrime. But what do these threats actually look like? And what are some of the practical ways to implement protective measures against these growing threats? Well, today's webinar is about just that. So we are very fortunate to have two highly recognized and respected experts in this field lined up for you today. Excuse me. One is from the legal side of things and the other is from the technology side. Great combination. Jamey Davidson, a partner at O'Hagan Meyer law firm, is a specialist in cyber-related law and litigation. Joining Jamey today is going to be Nathan Little, our Senior Vice President of Digital Forensics and Incident Response at Tetra Defense. Jamey's going to be sharing some real-life horror stories about wire transfer and ransomware, and Nathan's going to talk to us about how to avoid those types of things. So it ought to be a really good session. And of course, hosting today's session is a face that we are all very familiar with, Jay Reeves, the Alta Pro Risk Pro. Jay, too, is a lawyer and is a highly regarded expert in risk management, having been the vice president of North Carolina Mutual and the owner of the website dedicated to helping lawyers achieve work-life balance, yourlawlife.com. All right, before we get started, let's do the blocking and tackling and get that out of the way. So, to download a manuscript of the webinar, go to altaprorpg.com post-webinar. You can also check your chat boxes here. There'll be links to get to these locations. This webinar is approved for an hour of CLE. You must complete the survey to receive your credit. You must complete the survey to receive your credit. And also, please allow for up to 30 days to receive the certificate. Now, if you need something a little sooner, let us know and we'll do everything we can to accommodate your individual needs. There will be two codes revealed during the webinar that you'll need to remember, so write them down. They will be sent during the webinar and write them down. You will have to enter those codes in the survey at the end to prove that you were actually a participant in the webinar. Now, we know that some folks are joined via phone and others are maybe sharing a computer or on a desk. If that's the case, email us at info@altaprorpg.com and we will send you a form to fill out so you can get your CLE. All right. Now, for the questions, we're going to try to carve out about 10 minutes at the end to handle the questions. So go ahead and send them via the Q&A function and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And some good news here, attendees that are eligible for a 5% off a safe law policy. If you are already a customer and your renewal coming up, you'll get that 5%. If you take out a new policy, you'll get 5%, so ask your agent. So that takes care of the blocking and tackling. And there's one more thing before we get started. We're extremely excited to be announcing another great value-added service from Alta Pro's Risk Management Group, and that's going to be, we call it Dr. J's Office Hours, hosted by none other than our own risk pro, Jay Reeves. Jay will be holding court the first Tuesday of every month, starting Star Wars Day, May the 4th be with you, at 12 Central. You kind of just think of Jay as a college professor here. You know, in those days when you're in a big lecture hall and you couldn't ask questions, so you scheduled time with your professor afterwards during their office hours. Well, that's what Dr. J's Office Hours is all about. So during the 1-hour office session, Jay will be fielding live questions from the audience, and with his vast body of knowledge as a law professional, offer guidance and commentary to assist in any way possible. We'll also be featuring, guest participants offering advice and knowledge in their own areas of expertise. So be sure to check this out. Should be a great way to get help or answer questions and any that you may have, as well as those from other people if you're afraid to ask questions, so you can hear what the other questions are. So you can register for this in several ways, in the chat right now, also in the post attendee emails you'll be getting. So check it out and spread the word. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. J. Doctor?
Thank you, Todd, and welcome everybody to Alta Pro Live. One correction, college professor, maybe picture me as a junior high school, maybe even kindergarten.
I'm checking out now.
but I hope you all join me. As Todd said, my name is Jay Reeves. I'm better known as the Risk Pro. This guy here is the on-call personal practice consultant for all lawyers and firms insured through AltaPro. Maybe you've got a question. How do I deal with a particularly difficult client? How long do I have to hold on to closed case files? And how do I dispose of them safely? Or maybe just how do I grow my practice? Well, go to our website, altaprorpg.com, shoot us an email, and before you can say problem solved, the Risk Pro will show up, and together we'll brainstorm a solution. This is chapter 4 of our ongoing webinar series on cybersecurity. And each of these programs has brought you different experts and specialists in the cyber field. In case you missed any of the 3 prior installments, chapter 1 was 10 things every lawyer should know about cyber safety. Chapter 2 was going inside the mind of the cyber criminals. And chapter 3 was putting it all together in your law firm. In case you missed any of those, they're all available on the AltaPro YouTube site. So go to YouTube, check them out at your convenience, and while you're there, subscribe to our channel. Also, before I go any further, I want to thank all of you, the attendees. You're the reason we're here, and you're the reason these webinars have been successful. Today, we have more than 300 lawyers and insurance agents and brokers from all across the country, Texas, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois. So thank you for showing up. And not only showing up, but you've told us what you want to know. And we've listened. So we try to bring you programs that are relevant and that address your concerns. So to that end, by popular demand, let me kick off today's program. It's called Best Practices Cyber for 2021. And as Todd said, the program will be roughly divided into 2 parts. First, we're going to look at some actual claim cyber horror stories with a particular emphasis on fraudulent transfers. We see this in the news all the time. And if we're lawyers, we see it in the lawyer news, and ransomware / social engineering. And then we're going to bring in a digital forensic specialist to tell us what we can do to avoid becoming a horror story ourselves. And spoiler alert, some of the best things you can do are absolutely free and they're easy. So stay tuned for that. We want this to be an interactive program. I've babbled on enough here. We want to hear from you as well. So let's kick things off by asking our audience a question. Question number 1, and I'm going to pass the baton to our expert, Jamey Davidson. Jamey, this is first of all, Jamey, welcome, and thank you for being here. And Jamey, you're on mute, so.
There we go. Thank you for the introduction. Well, these, I think that the answer to the first question is going to be pretty simple. If you read through all of these answers and you see the all of the above at the bottom, I think that's where we're all going to end up with our answer. But a couple of stories to actually help you understand these the importance of these procedures is that there are a couple different ways that we see fraudulent funds transfer loss, and they're often very unsophisticated frauds that lead to large loss, and especially in some large law firms that deal in real estate, wills and trusts, things like that. The first example I have is the internal, what I call the internal example. And you see a lot of times an email, a purported email from the owner of the company or the CFO of the company or someone who has the authority to instruct others to make a payment internally to, say, an administrative assistant, or more likely someone in the accounting department or the comptroller to send out a wire. And a good example is the payment of vendors. So, yeah, and I had one issue where a company was going through a large scale remodel of their offices. They were really excited about it. And the administrative assistant / do everything person in this smaller company, who also was the accountant, received an email from the owner of the company saying, hey, wire out $400,000 to this vendor that we're using, and the money goes out the door. A couple weeks later, the first time that the administrative assistant / accountant had seen the president of the company who purportedly sent the email, he said, hey, I made that payment you asked. And his, what payment? And by that time, 2 weeks had passed, so recalling the wire didn't work. And the receiving institution had received the money. The money was gone. It had been withdrawn and was simply gone. And that's a $400,000 loss on a wire transfer. The scary thing about that example is no one was breached, right? There was no breach of anyone's computer system to pull this off. The way you can do that is you can go to any company's website, and if they have their leadership team, you can find out who the CFO or the comptroller is. You go to LinkedIn, and the same is true with people in accounting professionals. They have Facebook pages that say, hey, I'm now the accounting executive at this company, and we're going through a large-scale office remodel. So just going through that type of information that you can get in publicly available forums, it's not necessary, right, that you actually have a computer breach to get there. The second issue, example on the fraudulent funds transfer loss, is the external situation. And this can be the result of a breach, or it can be, again, sort of a social engineering situation where no breach at all has occurred. What we see this a lot is for you real estate lawyers out there, especially in states where a real estate lawyer acts similarly to a title company. In Illinois, we're a little separate. Usually the title company holds funds, and lawyers don't get involved in that. But in some states where that occurs, the lawyer will be holding funds for a real estate closing, and classic, at the last minute, we'll get the email saying, don't wire the closing funds here, wire them over to this bank account, this bank address. And oftentimes in a small law firm setting, it could be a paralegal, it could be an office administrator. There might not be a sophisticated system of checks and balances, right? And so the paralegal may be the one who has the authority to initiate the wire. And again, unless there's a recall that occurred, or you caught it quick enough to let the receiving bank know that money's gone, and then you have a client or an opposing party in a sale, the opposite party in a sale, who either says, one, I want to buy that property and now I don't have, the funds didn't go there, or two, where's my seller proceeds? And so it's the number of that factual scenario, the amount of times we see that is just, it's really astounding. And it's especially true in the small 1 to 10 people law firms that specialize in real estate closings. Money's going in and out the door every day.
And Jamey, let me jump in. You're right on the money. A lot of our attendees are just who you described, small firms, 1 or 2 lawyers. And I know you're a practicing attorney yourself. You also represent lawyers who get in trouble, and you're a cyber expert. So you sort of have wear all the hats. But one thing that struck me when you were talking is it doesn't take a rocket scientist to sort of understand how this works. And when you mentioned the bad guys can get your email from LinkedIn or wherever, most everybody's website has contact info and has your email and a
100%.
Contact us page. So we're almost inviting them to come in. So in answer to this first question, I'm very pleased, and I know the CEO of Alta Pro is pleased to see that only 2% says they rely on information on email. It looks good. It appears to come from a legitimate source. And a whopping 97% say, I will make the phone call to see if this is legit. So that's good news.
Yeah, and another thing about the real estate transfer, for example, even if you take the steps to have good internal practices that may prevent your emails from getting breached, right? Think about the transaction. You have buyers and sellers that are probably using a Yahoo or a Google account that they've had for 20 years. You don't know what the real estate agents are using. You don't know what the title company is using. And if somebody's email is breached simply by looking at the email address, it could come from that address. Their email could have been breached. It might not be a situation where the email address is off. It might actually be coming from that person's email that actually had the breach. So, some of the things that we can do to prevent these issues, I think I made the comment during the warm-up, the practice rounds of this webinar, is that 99% of cybercrime fraudulent funds transfer loss will be prevented by a phone call. And the phone call that I'm talking about is the person who sends you the email. Call them and ask them, hey, did you just send me these wire instructions? Because the number of times I've had reported claims to me to say, hey, look, this just happened, but we made a phone call and it was clear that there was no one at the other end, or it was clear that this was a scam, and they just want to report it because they were afraid maybe their computer got breached and they wanted to check it out. I almost say that this wouldn't be a topic of discussion if that phone call were made. That's how, because Nathan's going to give you some great advice on how to prevent that from an IT standpoint. But again, it doesn't take an IT professional to pick up the phone and say, did you just send me these wire instructions for $250,000? Because some firms, 1 to 10 attorneys especially, losing that kind of money breaks a year, right? It's salaries that are to be paid. And
and Jamey, I think you're absolutely right. The phone call it's not the foolproof method, but it's the method that works every time. Like we try to teach people a lot how to identify an illegitimate email, but they're getting more believable all the time. So it's just like a race to constantly keep up with the attackers, but making that phone call is so important. I think I'd also add, because I find a lot of our clients where we're responding to incidents like this, I'd also add to make sure you're calling the real person. A lot of these cyber criminals will take, so say they're pretending to be me, they'll take the Nathan Little signature, they'll use a different phone number in that signature block, so that if you call, and maybe you haven't spoken to me in person, or maybe you speak to me every couple of months and you don't really recognize my voice, you may call them and they might say, yeah, it is me, we had to change our bank last minute, we're in a bit of a hurry, can you make sure that you wire it today? So calling a contact method that is that person, especially if it's somebody that you can't identify their voice easily on a phone call.
It's a great point, because in the best practices that we send out, we always say to a known phone number, and this especially cuts down, the example I gave about the boss sending the email, I can't imagine any employer is going to be a little upset because they got a call from their accounting department saying, are we really supposed to wire out $300,000 to this carpet vendor? I don't think anyone who runs a business is going to have a problem with that. The other thing that we talk about too is we use a system in my firm where not only would we require the callback on all transactions, but we also have it set up with a certain dollar figure from our bank, and that could be for some people 5,000, for some people 50,000, whatever that dollar figure may be, that if a wire is initiated with our bank and it's over that threshold amount, the bank calls our firm's COO and says, can you verify that this is what, and so for some time, that's not going to catch everything. That's why that first phone call is more important. But what that can catch is the situation like, no, we're not going through an office remodel right now. So no, there's not supposed to be a $50,000 check going out to this contractor. We would never hire, we haven't hired this contractor. And small businesses are going to know that, right? If you're especially a 1 to 10 attorney law firm, you're going to get a phone call and say, no, we haven't been on trial for 2 years, so why would we be paying a trial graphics company? And that we see those exact examples, right? And then the last point, the forwarding of wire instructions. you know, a lot of times what we see is this could be for third-party liability. It's, well, yeah, you didn't wire the money, but you forwarded on the fraudulent instructions to me. You know, and that happens down the line, especially real estate closings, any type of deals like that, where you get these instructions, just hit forward, you know, think about it. One thing you can do also is scroll across the email address, because when these people send these emails, it'll come across as Jamey Davidson. But when you actually click on the email address, you can tell it's not my email, right? So that's one way to sort of avoid those. But those are the easiest things to do to prevent those type of issues. And that's all non-technical human error type situations that can be avoided.
Jamey, just great advice. And I'm the old timer here. I've been practicing and working with lawyers for 40 years, and a lot of it boils down to communication, doesn't it? That's so much of a key to all risk management. Clear communication, right? Maybe even pick up the phone during the transaction and make sure we're all on the same page. We're reading from the same sheet. We know exactly how this should be going down.
100%. And I can tell you that COVID-19 and working from home, you know, instead of walking down the hallway and saying, hey, Steve, did you really ask me to wire $100,000? You get an email, right? And then you email the bank, make this happen, you know? And so that's why these callbacks and these human voices and these procedures, especially some companies may end up being more remote even after everybody's vaccinated and wherever everyone's back in their offices, right? So these procedures, especially for those type of companies, we got a person who's on the move a lot, that travels a lot, and it's not as much personal contact as it is emails or texts or whatever. These procedures can prevent so much of that wire fraud.
And Jamey, as we prep for this program, did I hear you say that if you have some sort of cyber policy or cyber protection insurance, that if you don't do some of these things, like to call and make sure, you could be jeopardizing your coverage?
You could be jeopardizing coverage. Some policies, even the carriers that I respond for, have language that says, but only if you make a confirming phone call. And so that, you know, so that way, if you made that confirming phone call, somebody picked up the phone and you talk to a live person, again, the number of times you'll call and it's not a live person, but the number of times you'll say, hey, look, that's not Melissa's phone number. I've talked to her 30 times in the last 2 months, going back and forth. That's not her phone number, or that's not her voice, you know? So those type of things, right? 100%.
One final comment I'd like you to talk about concerning our polling question. Question number 2 talked about ransomware losses, and it looks like most people guessed the correct answer, 8.9 million in 2019. And I believe you say, Jamey, that number may be a low estimate.
Oh, it's multiples of that. And I see Nathan shaking his head. I've probably authorized Nathan to make that much in ransom payments in the last year. So it's a big proliferation. Ransomware, the proliferation in ransomware and ransom payments is because the changing nature of the risk. And to go through that as three examples of ransomware and what people think that they are, what it is, and what it's evolved into. The traditional original ransomware threat was you get some sort of alert, your files are locked and you can't get into anything, right? And for simple layman's terms, the only thing, you know, what they're trying to make you pay for is a key, essentially a decryption key that unlocks what they've locked up. They can't see it, they can't take it, they just found a way to lock it, right? And for the longest time, 2015 to 2017, 2018 even, especially in the smaller firms, we were dealing with $5,000 payments, $10,000 payments. That's just not what it is anymore. That's still out there. But in that original situation, you have, you know, 2 options. You'll find out if you have a good backup or not. And Nathan will talk about about backups, but you were faced with 2 options. You either paid the ransom to get the key, and some people are adverse to paying criminals in any circumstance. But if you're not backed up properly, then you really have no other choice if you want to get your data back. that was the original threat in ransomware, and you still see it. And the numbers certainly have gone up because as the criminals progress, their tactics get better. Their what they actually do is, you know, more beneficial to them. And if they happen to get a big company or a mid-sized company that thought they had a good backup and don't, then again, all right, well, how much is it worth to you for all of your data, all of your customer information? And, you know, that starts getting into much higher numbers than the 8 to 10,000. That's the hundreds of thousands. That's the 7 figures, you know, and that's kind of what we're seeing.
Right.
But the real change to the threat, it happened a little while back, but it really took off the second part of this year a lot, or the summer of 2020. I saw a lot, and it just kind of continued. It's the exfiltration of data, right? And so what these, it's almost a different type of risk. You know, I always talk about the difference between a ransom payment and an extortion payment. And so a lot of these new variants, not only do they lock your data up and like, well, I got a great backup, so I don't have to pay you. But what they also do is they steal it. They exfiltrate the data. And then they say, we're going to post it publicly on our site if you don't pay us this. To some people, you know, it's kind of a shrug of the shoulders. You know, I don't have anything worth protecting. To most lawyers, that's not true. And, you know, I won't get into the specifics, the exact specifics of one of the horror stories that I had, but this was an abuse type situation where the names of clergy members and their victims were stolen. How much are you going to pay to protect that? Right? And so they had a great backup in that instance, backed up right away, you know, up and going, cloud-based storage. I mean, functionality restored in 2 days. You know, they were able to separate the forensics from the functionality, and they were up and going, not even a business interruption claim, just full speed ahead from the work side of things. That's not typical, but in this situation, it's what happened. But there was a large payment made in order to stop this data, this information, this confirmed, very confidential information from being posted publicly. And so to me, it's like a different threat. We all think of ransomware as that lock up, I can't get into my files, but the lock and extort situation has been much more prolific in the last year. And, you know, I always say that the people on this, or that, you know, that have cyber risk insurance, you know, you're doing the right thing, because, you know, it protects against this. It gets your system back and going. Even if you don't have to pay the ransom, you have coverage for restoration expense. But one thing that that everyone has to worry about is, this is a great segue into Nathan, because he's going to give you some ways to help prevent these things from happening, right? Is that, don't just say, well, I've got insurance, and if this happens where I'm ransomed or whether I'm extorted, I can simply just have my insurance company pay this ransom. The OFAC sanctions list, ransomware is a big problem, and these are sophisticated groups that pull these off. Not just people that you talk about, you know, as we talked about, you hear, oh, there's somebody sitting in their bed in the Ukraine playing around on a computer. No, these are sophisticated, organized criminals. And oftentimes they have ties to terrorist groups or countries that are known to harbor or support terrorists. And in those situations, if they're on the OFAC list, or they're known connected to be on the OFAC lists, you can't legally make a payment, right? Or at least, and no insurance company is going to authorize it, no bank's going to authorize it. And so I've actually had situations where people had no other choice than to personally pay and hope they didn't get caught, essentially, because they had no other option to get their materials back. So that's why what Nathan's going to talk about is so important, because there are ways to address these problems once they happen, but the best way to do it is to make it not happen in the first place.
All right, give me 1 second and then I'll share my screen. We don't have too many slides, just a couple of guiding slides. So everybody should be able to see it now. And there's actually a few really good questions that came into the Q&A section, and then some directly in the chat, which I'm trying to keep an eye on too. But if you put them directly into the Q&A section, I'll definitely see them because there'll be points I talk about.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for doing that. And you too, Jamey. We're getting great questions. And remember, you can continue the conversation with our two experts after the program. Feel free to reach out. But Nathan?
Yeah. So as Jamey was saying, extortion attacks is kind of what we call them these days, because the attackers don't care why you have to pay them. They just care that they get paid. So they keep adding additional methods to increase the probability that you'll have sometimes no choice to pay them, but sometimes it's actually the best thing for your business to pay them to protect the data. Jamey was saying a lot of times law firms, the nature of the business you're in and the clients you have, sometimes that's more valuable than even major financial clients we deal with or medical clients. Like, this is data that if it got out about active litigation or whatever, I don't know as much about the legal world as everybody else on this, but talking to clients, a lot of it is we need to do everything we can to protect this data. And although a ransom payment does not guarantee that the attackers will delete it, it really comes down to their business model, because that's what it is for them. These groups, it's a business. They know that if somebody pays for them to delete data and they don't do it, their reputation, they have a brand of attack that they do, they won't be able to get paid in the future. Now, I'm certainly not advocating for the payment to cyber criminals. It's just the nature of the world we're in. Sometimes it actually does make sense. But a big portion of what I want to talk about is how can you take some really simple steps to hopefully not be a victim of an extortion attack, and full cybersecurity practices. You've probably seen, here's the 37 things, or here's the 250 security controls you need to implement to have proper cybersecurity practice. That's not what we're going to cover here. We're just going to try to talk about some of the most common causes and things you can do to avoid being a victim. All right, so then going over the agenda here, some things we're going to talk about: safe remote access, especially last year. 2020 was the year for cyber extortion attacks and other cyber incidents too, but mainly extortion attacks to happen by attackers using the remote access that organizations set up to work from home during the pandemic, but not just during the pandemic, all the time. And attackers love that remote access, because if you can remotely access your network, if the attackers compromise your usernames and passwords, or they are able to use some sort of misconfiguration to their advantage, they can access your systems and your network the same way that you do. So with the rapid switch to everybody working from home, what we call the attack surface, which is just the potential victims of these attacks, just increased exponentially. And we saw it took from March this time last year until about September for the attackers to really victimize all of the new remote access that was set up. But it's really their favorite and easiest attack method. So we're going to go over how to make sure your work from home access for you, your employees, is safe. We'll talk a little bit about multi-factor authentication and what that is and why it's so important. Also talking about backups too. There was already some questions about backups in the Q&A that I'll get to about, can the attackers lock your backups? And the simple answer is yes, if they're not configured correctly. The work from home access really relates perfectly to the poll that's up. So if everybody wants to answer that about, do you work from home? Do you allow members of your team to work from home? And then what type of remote access do you use? a lot of people don't know, which is why we have the last option there, which is, well, we're not really sure what it's called. All we know is we click this and we get remote access that was set up, and we'll dive a little bit more into that. And then at the end, in preparing this presentation, I was asked, what are the top 3 things to do? Or I think the question was not even just top 3, but what can be done for small law firms to prevent being victims of these types of incidents? And there's some pretty simple things that you can either implement yourself or ask whoever manages your IT, say, hey, I know I'm supposed to do this. Can you implement it? And typically it's pretty inexpensive.
Nathan, I'm just going to jump in. Obviously, you're the man we need here. The polling results, almost 80% are working from home, at least part-time, and 60%, 6 out of 10, are allowing members of their team to work from home.
Yep. And I can still see the poll on my screen, but not the results. I'm not sure if they're displayed to everybody or not yet, but do we have some stats on what type of remote access? Looks like they're being displayed now.
Yeah, we've got Windows Remote, 28%, VPN, 39%, hosted or cloud-based network by an IT professional, 25%, and then 24%. So pretty evenly allocated there.
Yep, which is really what we see kind of across the board in the industry. And I think the one specifically worth talking about right now is Windows Remote Desktop Access. Now, there's a few caveats to this that I'm going to try to keep pretty straightforward at the start, but there's a type of remote access to networks that a lot of people use, especially smaller organization, where people allow direct Windows Remote Desktop access to their work computers or a server or some sort of system on the work network from home. I actually have a video that I'll jump to right now. Give me 1 second. That just kind of shows what remote access looks like. Jay, just to confirm, can you see the video?
Yep.
Perfect.
Well, I don't have have you started the video?
I just started it. So
yep.
This is an example of what using Windows Remote Desktop Access to access your work network would look like. So you see the remote desktop connection window is opened. And then here, this might be, for most of you, if you use this would already be saved and pre-entered. But here, it's where this person in the video is entering the computer they'd like to connect to. And then it's asking here for the credentials to that remote desktop. And they're entering the credentials, hitting OK to log in. And then this screen is actually the remote computer. Now, it's really just that simple to use. And that's why so many people use it. You can actually, it's not the way that remote desktop was originally designed, but you can actually allow remote desktop directly into your network from anywhere in the world. I'm intentionally trying to keep this description really simple because every time I describe it, I always overcomplicate it because there are some variables to consider. But if you allow direct remote desktop to your network from the outside world, which a lot of people, 10 years ago, it was a really common IT setup to have. 20 years ago is even more common. People just said, wow, this internal remote access method for computers that's meant to just be used in the office to access like a server or some other system that's in a different room. We can make a network change and allow this from the outside world for work from home access. And what we commonly call that is external Windows Remote Desktop, which just means people can use remote desktop from the outside world to access the network without being VPN'd into the network first. Because a lot of you, maybe not a lot of you, some of you are thinking, well, I use Windows Remote Desktop, but I have to log into the VPN first, which puts me on the network. that's different, and that's something to think about too. But what I'm referring to in this situation is direct external RDP access that's on all the time. You could go to any computer in the world, and if you entered the network address of your office, username and password, you would get into your system. The reason I cover that specifically is because for smaller law firms, exposed remote desktop is the most common, what we call the root point of compromise, the cause of cyber extortion incidents for those law firms. It's a really common setup for law firms to have because it's so convenient, but it's convenient remote access for you, and the attackers love to do it. What they actually do months, for years, for even longer, they will just send external requests to try and guess usernames and passwords to your systems, or gain access to the username and password in other ways. And eventually somebody gets the username and password and they can log in, they can sell that access to a different attack group, and they can log in just as you start exploring your network, stealing data, encrypting data. And there's a lot of components to that. There's a lot of other ways to compromise Windows Remote Desktop, but the bottom line is, if your method of remote access is Windows Remote Desktop directly from the outside world, that's the biggest ransomware risk that any company has. So much so, like if we're working with Jamey or working with a client and they say, we had a ransomware attack, we're not sure how it happened, and then we start asking about their method of remote access, if they say, we allow direct RDP access, we tell them, we'll verify in the investigation, but that's almost certainly how the attacker got in. So then with that, the common question is always, well, what is a safe type of remote access? There's many different safe types of remote access, and the simplest way I can categorize is a type of remote access to the network safe is it should require some sort of multi-factor authentication, second form of authentication. All of us have experienced multi-factor authentication at some point, because many online banks, logging into them, you'll get a text message or some sort of, after you enter your password, have to use an authentication app to enter a 6-digit code, something like that. That's what multi-factor authentication is. And generally speaking, it's not a perfect solution, but if whatever type of remote access you use has multi-factor authentication, you're probably relatively safe. That's just because passwords, usernames and passwords in so many instances are compromised. And if those are used for remote access and attackers compromise them, they can immediately gain access to your network, which is the first step to deploying a cyber extortion attack. So making sure that you have multi-factor authentication, and also making sure that you especially don't use exposed Windows Remote Desktop to access your network will drastically reduce your risk to a cyber extortion attack for a smaller organization. So there's quite a few questions here. I'll try to field some of them. I know we don't have a ton of time left. Regarding the extortion payments, because that is something that I do want to touch on. Jamey mentioned the sanctions checks and other things that we're dealing with. So a couple of questions have come in. Well, why would you pay an extortion if they could just re-extort you again? Sometimes there's risks to being re-extorted during an attack. We actually don't typically see that because their goal is to monetize their current extortion incident and move on to the next victim and maintain the reputation of their extortion group, their attack group, as if you pay them, it will actually resolve the incident. And then that helps them get paid by other victims. So it's certainly something to consider. And payment of a ransom is never something you want to rely on to protect the data, nor does it protect it to 100% certainty. If an attacker is threatening to publicly release data that's stolen, and you've worked to verify, or a forensic firm like us has worked to verify that data is stolen, we always say paying the ransom reduces the risk to the data seeing the light of day or being published. And we've seen it reduce risk almost every single time, but it doesn't guarantee that it won't be released. So when you look at every extortion incident, and hopefully you never find yourself in one, there's always a risk to evaluate. Is it better to not pay the ransom, better to pay the ransom? And that's different for every situation.
Nathan, there's one question. Sorry for jumping in here. Is Chrome remote desktop significantly differ from Windows remote desktop?
So it is significantly different in the fact that it is not as risky as Windows remote desktop. And the reason is the Windows remote desktop, you can run a search on a service. It's basically like Google, but for cyber criminals. You can say, hey, show me every organization that has Windows remote desktop exposed right now. And you can just start to attack those organizations. Chrome remote desktop is not that easily viewable to attackers. So same type of risk for malicious authentication if somebody knows how to log in and knows your username and password. So multi-factor authentication is important, but it's a lot less risky than exposed Windows remote desktop, which should never be used. But Chrome remote desktop was actually designed for safe, simple remote access, but you should use multi-factor authentication with it. Okay, so then before we answer a couple more questions, I do want to talk about the sanctions aspect and the situations where a ransom payment won't work, and quickly touch on backups. I know we're a little bit short on time, but the Windows remote desktop was the biggest thing I wanted to cover because we just see so often it's used for attacks. Jamey touched on earlier, ransom payment is not something that should be part of your disaster recovery plan. It is a last resort that very frequently people actually do have to pay these extortion demands to recover their data or for the non-release of data. But there's many situations where ransom payment is either impossible, and that's where it's a sanctioned group that we identify from Iran or certain attack groups in Russia that the US, the UN, other groups have actually listed as being sanctioned, and it's a federal crime to pay them anything. So we have certain groups, Dark Side Ransomware is one right now, Doppelpaymer Ransomware. These are very active groups that we as an organization, we will not pay, we will not help people pay them. They're sanctioned groups. It's a little bit of a gray area sometimes because attributing these attacks to certain groups is really challenging, and it's something we spend a lot of time on. But there's many situations where victims of ransomware cannot pay to get the data back or to prevent the non-release of data. The other thing that does happen, although rare and we can typically work through it, is the decryption programs purchased, they don't always work. For the most part, they will unlock the data and they will get the data back, but we can run into a lot of corruption. A lot of other issues can come up. It's not, a lot of people think, okay, my data was encrypted. Can we purchase the key and get past this? It is much, much less of a magic bullet than that. It's a pretty complex restoration effort. Takes a while to decrypt the data. You have to repair corruption. It's much faster to restore from backups. And in some rare cases, critical data doesn't decrypt properly. There's no way to get it back. So that's why you don't ever want to be dependent on paying a ransom, but sometimes it ends up being the only option, which is the clients that we will actually negotiate and help pay ransoms for. So then that, before we go into this top 3 that's on the screen right now, for backups, there was a question, can backups be impacted by ransomware? The answer is yes, and all the time. If a backup for your organization's critical data is attached to maybe the single server you have, maybe a set of servers, if it's attached like a USB drive or attached on the network, it is trivial for the attackers to encrypt it. And it's not an accident. They will specifically find out, they'll look at your server, look at your critical data and say, oh, they have a Cronus backup, they have Veeam backup, they use Windows backup. Let me find where those backups are stored and make sure I destroy or encrypt those first before I encrypt the rest of the data. The best backup you can put in place is something that has a local copy of the data, but if that local copy is impacted, you also have a third-party cloud-based version. So if you look up or talk to an IT provider about cloud backups that are very simple to use, very inexpensive, that will allow all of your data to be uploaded to a third-party cloud that's off your network, not something you maintain. And then, of course, you'd want that cloud backup account to be protected with multi-factor authentication. But then if your backups at your office are impacted, you can always download your critical data from that cloud copy. But yeah, just because you have a backup, unfortunately, all backups are not created equal. But for smaller organizations, it's fairly easy to figure out a backup solution that's really affordable, easy to implement, to make sure your data's safe, even in the worst case scenario. All right, so then the top 3, two we've already talked about, but the first, safe remote access, and I think the 2 points that will prevent, sometimes for small law firms, probably 99% of the incidents we actually see, safe remote access that is not exposed Windows remote desktop and has multi-factor authentication, you will be much safer than a lot of the people we respond to that were unfortunately a victim because of that exposed Windows remote desktop. Something we haven't talked about yet, but it's a fairly simple piece, just making sure that you're running antivirus software on each workstation, each laptop, each server, each system. That's just a nice layer of protection that ideally you'd have somebody manage, like an IT provider or somebody at your office is responsible for kind of making sure it's in place. I realize it's hard to make sure it's on all systems, and as attorneys, you're not necessarily monitoring antivirus solutions, but making sure you have some sort of protection on each system in case something gets through, that can help quite a bit. And then the third piece is just multi-factor authentication on any type of remote access for sure, and really anything that's available externally. I didn't even really have time to talk about it, but when Jamey was talking about the wire fraud that can be conducted without the compromise of accounts, one of the most common ways that we see when we're investigating wire fraud incidents that are cyber incidents is because people's email accounts are actually logged into by an attacker and they impersonate them directly. If you can put multi-factor authentication on email, that's like the technical control that will help in some situations. But the most important thing with wire fraud is what Jamey was saying earlier about picking up the phone.
Awesome, and thank you, Nathan. Jamey, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at some of the questions or if you have some thoughts based on what Nathan has shared.
Yeah, I'm looking at some of the chats that we've got there.
And again, remember, you can continue the conversation with our experts after the program.
One thing that I can comment upon what Nathan said too, I really, the one thing that stuck out about me is because the number of times that Nathan and I together have had to explain this is on the ransom payments about being a magic bullet, about getting back up quickly, that the period of disruption of your business, even paying a ransom, Nathan, I mean, it can be weeks, because you not only do you have the forensic evidence, you have the rebuild. And I mean, especially when people are working remotely, if your whole computer system's down for 2 weeks, it's not like you can just walk in and grab a file and start working. Or, oh, I got a bunch of court appearances or depositions. You were dependent upon working through our remote access so much that, you know, that's what that payment just doesn't take away that pain of, that avoids the time. And the number of people that just don't understand that, and we tell them it could be 2 weeks before your email's back. It could be
well, and just to jump in, you're right on point. I'm looking at the results from an American Bar Association legal tech survey on the damages. So it's not just a financial risk; it's a full practice risk on some of the consequences of a cyber attack or breach. And you hit on some: downtime, loss of billable hours, expense for replacing hardware or software, loss of client files, consulting fees. And this doesn't mention the insomnia, staying up at night, pulling your hair out, as if lawyers aren't stressed enough already. So there's lots of bad stuff, and it isn't all just dollars and cents.
I see a really good question here. It says, I have learned that law firms typically pay the ransom because it is the most expeditious as opposed to an investigation. And 2, they do not want the embarrassment to the public and their clients if they still have to notify clients of a breach. I think that's really good. But there's a couple of points in there to be made. The payment of the ransom does not negate the investigation. Because when you talk, because what we're looking at through the investigation is not just, okay, is your system safe? Of course, that's important, right? Rectify the problem. But it's also how it happened. How can you prevent it in the future? Was there data exfiltration? Because they'll say that there was, or they won't, sometimes the attackers won't say, but you have to rule that out. And for law firms, I mean, that's essential. Was their client data compromised? And so the investigation and the restore, although they might happen simultaneously, they are different things.
And I can jump in, Jamey, on top of that. Here in North Carolina, there's an ethics opinion. My guess is other states have them as well, requiring you to, telling you what you have to do to notify clients who might have been affected. So there's some ethical considerations as well.
On the embarrassment, the extortion piece, it's not just about yes, you still have to notify clients, but it's also the liability, the hurt on your business of that data getting out there. So yeah, it does stink. You go through all this to pay or to prevent the data from getting put out there, but you still have to go notify your clients. Well, yeah, it's your ethical obligation, but the business aspects of a law firm that's been put up on one of these sites, these public sites that says we have your information, we have your client data, it can be devastating.
Absolutely. And I hate, we could go on all day. I hate to bring it to an end almost, but we are at that time. And I want to thank our 2 experts, Jamey and Nathan. Thank you so much for being here. And as a risk manager, I would just say one message I heard throughout this: communication, talking to your insurance carrier and your agent, talking to your team, training your team about this stuff. It's not just for lawyers, it's for everybody. This is a firm issue, not just a lawyer issue, firm-wide. And also planning. I did a blog post on an ABA survey that said only, I think, 20% of firms, and all of those were big firms, is my guess, have a formal incident response plan. So come up with some plan for how you're going to react if something like this happens. Todd, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jay, and thank you, Jamey and Nathan. I got to tell you, I think, frankly, everybody would agree you guys both provided some really powerful, timely, relevant information, and honestly, valuable to any small business owner, not just law firms. So again, thanks. We also want to say thanks to the participants and hope you found this a worthwhile and valuable use of your time. In addition to the policies you have with us, I want to make sure we convey that the AltaPro Risk Purchasing Group is committed to delivering, high quality value-added services, designed to help you manage risk. That's the whole point of it. So in conclusion, I want to make sure that we remind you to complete the survey to receive your CLE credit. The survey will automatically open in your browser after the event, or you can get to it later through the link that you'll get at deltaprorpg.com. You do need to enter the two quote codes to qualify for the CLE. First code number 1 being Alta, the second one being Pro. You'll see the contact information that we have for everybody here on this slide. This deck is available to you as well. And I also want to make sure that before we close it up, don't forget the inaugural launch of Dr. J's office hours on May 4th. We hope to see you there armed with questions. So I want to wish you a great rest of your week, and thank you.